jealous. I love it. I love it.
All right. Welcome to Cocktails, Code, and Conversations, the first ever video podcast. When I thought about doing video, I was like, there's no way that I could have this pod and go on video without having Richard and Robert Block here.
Well, if I'd have known there was stairs or video involved, I might not have came.
Because I was like, for everything that I want for this podcast to be to have like some good, decent conversations over cocktails, like this is the group, right? This is one of the group that I was like, yeah, that's going to be a good one.
No doubt. Cheers.
So, cheers, gentlemen. We're here in Austin. Thank you guys for coming down. And the cocktail du jour is the Black Manhattan, picked by Mr. Richard Byrd, seconded by Mr. Robert Block. So I remember when I sent out the text, I was like, cocktails, what do you guys want? And Richard was like, Black Manhattan. I was like, of course he would choose a Manhattan. and Block was right behind him like, yeah, let's do that one. So I had obviously looked at the recipe. So for those at home, it's actually fairly easy to make. So it's 1 part Verda, 2 parts your whiskey. We are sipping on some Woodford Reserve. I would put it in front of the camera, but then, they didn't pay me for that, so we're not going to do that. But obviously, feel free to choose your own. So 1 part to 2 parts, pour over ice, and then just stir and pour. Oh, of course, and a couple of dashes of bitters. Mm-hmm. So it's supposed to be served in, I forgot the name of the cup, but it's the fancy cup. I don't have none of those, so we're just using these.
Glycerin? How do you say that?
Yeah, the Glencairn.
Yeah, the Glencairn.
Yeah.
Things.
Yep.
So
don't let me butcher words on video and audio now.
I mean, look, that's how it goes. So if you're listening, go ahead and make yourself pour a cocktail and chill with us for the next hour as we have some good conversations. And I thought it was fitting that it was Manhattan because the first time I met Richard, I don't know if this is the first time you met him, but the first time the 3 of us were at an event was it in Iowa? But it was one of those restaurants, and it was like a Morton's or something like that or whatever,
like
and we did the lunch.
City.
Was it Kansas City?
Yeah.
And we did like the lunch event, and that was the first time I met Richard. He had the bow tie on, and he's getting ready to go do his talk, and he goes up there with a Manhattan in his hand. I'm like, who is this guy? Like, the audacity of this guy. Like he comes up there having it in his hand, swirling. I'm just like,
I was just jealous that I had not built that into my routine yet. I mean, I stole that the next show.
So little did I know after that, like what was that, 2 years now?
Oh, man.
Oh, longer than that.
Was it longer? Are you serious?
We got to be
4 or
pushing
5.
5. Yeah.
No.
Richard,
man.
I met Richard even 2 years before that. He was a customer of mine back when he was still in the customer side of the industry.
Yeah.
But that was the first time we had spoke together was on that panel. And man, did I feel bad for the other 3 panelists.
Yeah.
There were other panelists?
Yeah, exactly.
It's funny you say that because as I've gone through the last few years and panelists have been pulled together and everything, the only person that was ever in the space even having a fighting chance, and I still love speaking with him, was like Adam Bosnian from CyberArk, right? Because Adam's funny. He was on several panels with us, right? And Adam, if you're listening, I'm going to say good things, but Adam has been around for so long in the industry relative to identity that he just sits and he watches and he sits and he watches, and as soon as he opens his mouth to speak, it took me the second time to understand it. It's like Moses, right? Like all of a sudden he just says, "No, you're wrong." Just quiet. "No, you're wrong. What you really need to think about." And I was like, anybody else? I don't remember from any of those panels, but Adam Bosnian, I always remember.
Oh, that first panel, there was an SC sitting on the end.
Oh,
I think he got thrown into the mix.
Yeah, that
late,
was just,
right?
yeah, that was.
That poor kid, he couldn't get a word in.
And so to help the listeners out, as I of course with you guys, I quickly got into it. Let's do some introductions.
Sure.
Because the listeners don't know you guys as well as I do. So we'll start to the left, Mr. Richard Byrd. Go ahead, introduce yourself, sir.
Richard Byrd. My title is fascinating. I'm a Chief Customer Information Officer for Ping Identity. It's a totally made up title.
I have one of those. So it's okay.
Well, yeah, like all good things made up over a cocktail. I spend a great deal of my time now speaking on identity security, data privacy, and most recently election security, mainly because they all rotate around the core of identity, but people don't normally think about that. And that's opened up all these opportunities. As Robert said, I spent 20 plus years in the corporate side. So I used to run these functions. I've been an IT director, IT executive management So I've seen, all the battles on that side. Did some consulting, and then joined Ping, and now I get to travel all around the world and talk about those subjects. Get to hang out with you and Robert and a whole host of other characters that make up the real core of folks that are moving the world around identity, and that's what I do.
Awesome. Mr. Block.
Robert Block. I also have a made-up title. It's Executive Services Director at Optiv. I, by trade, have grown up in this industry. I spent a number of years with big system integrators, a number of years with Big Four consultant agencies, down to small boutique proso firms, and now at a security integrator at Optiv for a number of years since, right? As I said in our last podcast, when I grew up in this space before it was ever called identity management, back when it was just called directory services, and that took us down a whole rabbit hole on that podcast. We're not doing that today.
We'll do that today.
You tune into other podcasts if you want to see that in the rabbit hole instead. But by and large, I've started to grow outside of identity, realizing identity is the backbone to everything. And it gets me into all these great conversations around threat and risk and cyber operations and the SOC and how do customers use identity in the context of all those other investments. And so that, to me, is the new enriching part of what I'm doing career-wise, is using identity as a platform to talk about all the other areas of cyber.
Right. So the first thing that I noticed is clearly I'm doing something wrong with my life because I don't have a made-up title. So that's clearly my goal is the next position I get, I need to be able to make up my own title. But for this specific panel, this group today, the main subject I want to talk about was the state of identity, right? When we look at just the past 20 years, combine all of our experience, what we've seen, what we've done, what we've implemented, and some of the cycles that we've seen in this industry, right? Every cycle has, or every industry has their own little cycles. I think specifically in identity, it's interesting. We have this, as it started to form, it was a cycle of big, huge, bloated software. We'll try and do everything, right? That didn't work. We broke that apart and split it into a bunch of different services. And now you're starting to see it go back the other way. Things are starting to kind of integrate back together again. But I think this current state where we're at right now is critical because we've got technology, we've got business that's actually looking at it. And so going forward, I think it's going to be pivotal in that we'll see a huge jump in identity. But that's my thoughts. I want to get your guys' thoughts on where you think the state of identity is today and where you think it's going.
Sure. Robert, you go first, man.
It sucks. And I don't know that we can avoid it per se.
Right.
I think what we've habitually done is tried to fix one problem at a time. Every problem we create, we then try to go fix, right? If we back ourselves all the way back up to directory services, we had them everywhere, and then we were like, hey, we got to consolidate them and make one centralized directory, and then then we put, now we have all these people that are manually being put here, now we have to provision. Oh, wait, now we're provisioning in and out, so there's no governance, so we created a governance industry. Oh, wait, we got to authenticate. Oh, wait, authentication's risky. Let's do a secondary authentication to solve the risky authentication. Like, all we're doing until recently is trying to put the next stopgap in front of the problem we've created for ourselves. Finally, and I'm be curious to this time-wise if you agree with any of this, finally we're at a place where we're trying to have a very risk-based, holistic conversation, and identity is the cornerstone of most of those conversations because the greatest risk is humans and their credentials. So we're not there yet, but I think maybe the conversation is in the right place finally.
Okay. Rich?
Yeah, I think those points are all fair, right? It's interesting kind of looking at it from having been the corporate practitioner. I always like to say that people, have me come and speak, and they're just, amazed at all of this knowledge that I have, because how could that be? Because identity's just become a thing, right?
How could that be? I'm kind of amazed too.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's like, people's attitude is like, oh, you're an overnight sensation 10 years in the making, right? But the truth is that we're in an interesting place in where identity is going, because we're on the very beginning edges of a hype cycle that's going to create problems. It already is. And that hype cycle is you're seeing the notion of digital identity standards. You're starting to see this in marketing material. You're starting to see the beginnings of what we see every time there is a hype cycle in any given technology, any given security solution, which is all of a sudden everybody is an identity company. And whether that be old line companies or brand new company, everybody all of a sudden is in the business of identity. And why I say that's dangerous as to where identity is today, is that the solution provider, and frankly, folks like us that sit around and talk, we tend to talk about really higher tier or higher order capabilities and benefits that'll come from digital identity, putting identity in the center, and 80 to 90% of the large companies and organizations and governments that we're working with still haven't cleaned up their Active Directory, right? I mean, they're
True that.
Yeah, when we look at where the foundations are literally trailing a decade behind where the capabilities are currently sitting, right? And I agree with you. They're going to the identity space relative to technology solutions, as well as control maturity, all these different pieces that bake in on the risk side, is going to explode. It already is, but there's the risk that we're going to see a bifurcation between companies that are moving hard and fast, and I mean frankly hard and fast and spending a lot of money, right? That's been deferred maintenance for years and years and years because they put all that money in other security solutions that simply exist because we can't confirm that you are who you say you are, right? We think about all the solutions all the tech that's out there, all the other controls were built around the fact that I couldn't prove that a human being or an entity was who they said they were.
Right.
Now that we move in that direction, we're just going to see tons of energy around it, but we're going to lose sight of the fact that there's going to be this separation between those that are pouring that money and resources and time and effort into it and those that are still trying to figure out how to clean up Active Directory. And the downside to that is that the bad actors in the world, I just wrote this earlier today, if you really want to understand how criminal hacking works, just look at a pack of hyenas, right? They go after the weak and the young, right? Those are always going to be the most tempting targets. So if people are still cleaning up the junk and other people are up here, the ones cleaning up the junk are the ones that are going to get crushed, in terms of...
Yeah, the real front runners, the innovators, have vulnerabilities they're not aware of yet because they're out there innovating.
Right.
So that's a great attack point. And then to your point, the laggards, the senior citizens who have not quite gotten off that homegrown application represent just as much of an attack surface for the attackers.
Yeah,
you said
rich.
something, though, that I want to go back to, in that you said everybody is an identity company. I mean, I really, truly think everybody, and I mean even businesses, not solution providers, right? Everybody is an identity company in that no matter what you do for a business, you're a tech company.
Right.
If you're a tech company, you're a security company. If you're a security company, you're an identity company. Because the biggest commodity is at risk is your people and their access and their privilege in that data, right?
Yeah, but the challenge is that model breaks down in the operational realities, right? Which is you are and you have to be in the identity game, but the truth is that you're not, because you're not providing the securitization of the identity. What we still see, I just saw one published the other day, another architectural diagram that was a spin-off of the same 7-layer cake. I mean, we're still stuck on the OSI 7-layer model, right? I mean,
Hey, defense in depth, been around for 50 years.
Yeah, and it was just another variation. This one was so weird because, the asset, the database and whatever was still in the center, and an identity had disappeared. It used to be like in the third tier. It was like gone.
It was gone, yeah.
Right, and so we're still building architectural models and security frameworks around this notion of this layer cake, right? And then we try and make up for it with, a couple of, I go crazy about this one, with a couple of years of talking about, identity is a new perimeter, right? And because we're still talking about things like...
Listen, marketing owns identity, no doubt.
Yeah,
Because I think it's fundamentally, right, how we think about security and safety, is building walls.
Yeah.
And keeping things out. I think it's human nature to say, I want to protect something, so I need to put stuff around it to keep things out. We live in houses, right? And we put things around the houses. Inside the houses, it's, we build doors, we build entrances. Like everything is built to, I'm going to put everything I want inside and build around it. That's just a natural human response to safety and security. And we've taken that. And so we're just going to do the same thing in the digital realm is whatever I have that's important, I'm going to put in the middle, and then I'm going to surround things around it. The interesting that I found out one thing that I find interesting is like when Google did the whole Beyond Corp thing and the whole zero trust thing, right? As everybody was talking about it, marketing people grabbed onto it, so everybody had to have some kind of say to it. What I thought was funny was that people weren't realizing that was like, if you don't get what this is saying, like that if you can, to your point, Richard, truly authenticate and know who somebody is, right? 60% of the security market is gone. I don't need any of your services, right? Goodbye firewall, goodbye. Like all these things are gone. I'll put you all out of business because now those only exist because specifically I don't know. I don't trust who you are.
Yeah, but oddly
right?
enough, it's been that way forever, but identities only became part of the security conversation in the last 3 years, 4 years.
Yeah, no, that's true.
True.
That's true.
Which is crazy. Like it's been an infrastructure, plumbing, and certification conversation, yet the firewalls and all the other perimeter defense mechanisms aren't really stopping the attacker from leveraging the credential.
Well, and I think that, the reality of that, and I'm glad you actually brought that mechanic up. The reality of that is a complicator for where the digital identity world is today. And that complicator is that we've spent 30 years building an entire base of CapEx and OpEx around all of those other technical solutions and technologies. So now there's a massive vested interest, in big segments of these industries relative to security to maintain the status quo, right? So anytime, we saw this dynamic already, right? When physical firewalls went to virtual firewalls, oh my gosh, like there were holy wars, right?
There's virtual firewalls.
When we saw this, we saw this shift of whether it's virtualization or cloud or whatever, it strikes up these big philosophical and theological marketing battles for the most part, right? Saying, oh my gosh, you can't trust that new tech, right? Because, and really what they're saying is you can't trust that new tech because you're going to take three points out of my market share,
Right.
right? And now, like I saw a study the other day that suggested for the first time in the tracking of information security spend, that for the first time ever, whether you use the NIST or the ISO model, whether it's 5 or 9, among the 5 or 9 security domains, for the first time ever, a significant percentage, the primary percentage of spend over the next 5 years is going to go to identity. That is threatening, right? That's not just threatening to the tech, providers and the solution providers. That's threatening to existed landed staff at companies. Am I going to lose my job? So it's cool to talk about this shift and that it's inevitable, but it is not going to be frictionless. It is not going to be painless, right? It's going to cause some big land battles, man. I mean, in the industries as well as in companies.
But no change ever is, though, right? I mean, that's, and I think that's one of the things that, it's cool to talk about innovation. It's cool to talk about, what's going to be the next big thing. And we gloss over the fact that you look anywhere in life, that kind of change, evolution, is never painless. Mm-hmm. Because to disrupt something, you have to change the way something currently is done and shift the way people think about or how they operate or do something, right? So that's the part that I think people underestimate. And so we can sit here and talk all day, oh, we're innovative, we're going to do this, we're going to move really fast. That's great. But all that fast change, all that innovation means you are taking over for something that was there. Mm-hmm. And that thing that was there has to go somewhere. Those people that used to move those buttons got to go somewhere, right? And I think when it comes to security specifically in organizations and how they look to secure things, the customer, I feel, is between a rock and a hard place. Because it's like, look, I barely can find the talent that I have now to do the things the way we do it today. Like, I'm barely holding on, right? And we can talk about the skills gap and all the recs that they have open. That's great. Now you're telling me, on top of that, things are going to shift and I'm going to have to do them differently. Mm-hmm. So my staff of maybe 10, 12, whatever, let's call it 20 security personnel, just barely has everything they need now. Like it took them 5 years to feel comfortable to where my lead gal says, look, we got this, boss. We're covered. We understand everything. And now you're telling me things are going to shift and change. That's just, I feel for the customers in that position because it's like, what do we tell them? Like, oh, here, we shifted everything and here's this new thing.
Mm-hmm. Vendors become, in that world, vendors become partners. And I know every vendor says, we're your partner. And every solution provider says, we're your partner.
Right.
But the only way that model really starts to truly work is when they truly ink real partnerships. Because, to your point, the company can't do it all on their own.
Right.
So I won't use the words like managed service provider. But the idea is you're going to have to find partnerships where you can share the burden and the work efforts and the workloads and responsibilities with whomever you've chosen to do business with much like companies who would generate revenue together would get together and create a new offering by blending their companies. They're going to have to start to think about security the same way because they can't do it all by themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a recognition. It's so weird to say this that, I kind of feel in certain aspects the U.S. government's leading the way a little bit on this idea of
We're going to have to delete that from the podcast.
Jesus.
There's no way. We wouldn't have nearly enough alcohol
Right?
to say the government's innovating or leading, but go ahead.
Well, they're not, but they're what. So I've had the really good fortune of this last year to be able to do a lot of work in D.C. Working with a friend of all of ours, Jeremy Grant, the Better Identity Coalition. And it's the first time that I've been able to have a direct conduit into the workings of the U.S. government. And through it, a great example of what you're saying is that Rajiv Mathur, who's the CIO for the Social Security Administration.
Dude, Bird is a name dropper, just to be clear.
Well, we got to get you drop a name, you get a tag, you get more viewers, right? Interesting dude because he's had the background both in the corporate world as well as in the government world, and in having conversation with him, he said, look, we recognize in at least in the SSA, but in the U.S. government in general, that this stuff is shifting so fast that we can't start from scratch to rebuild it. So the notion of something like not a national identifier, but a national authenticator, right, which is part of the conversation that's going on in Washington now, the notion of a national authenticator, because frankly, everybody on the planet knows that your Social Security number has been co-opted 30 times, right? It's an identifier. It's not an authenticator. It's no longer a unique value proposition. And he goes, in order for us to be able to build the next, we can't do it ourselves, right? He goes, we can't create enough technical knowledge, momentum, all of that. We're going to have to work in public-private partnership in order to make that happen. So, and that's not the only example. The U.S. Department of Treasury and the Department of Defense, they're all looking at this because they have the same problem, right? When you think about their nation-state risk, or you think about their financial risk relative to the system, their same problem is when you look at what's been happening at the IRS year over year, synthetic fraud, stealing of Social Security numbers from youngsters and turning those into full-fledged digital human beings, and then taking tax refunds that don't belong to them. I mean, every year they shut down processing because some other wave of accounts of or refunds have come in, tax forms, and so the exposures relative to understanding that they're related to authenticatable identity is becoming really, really clear in the government. I say that it leads in the government. It'll take longer for them to implement the solution, but it has taken shorter for them to recognize the problem than in most companies that I work with.
So I agree. Like if you looked at what the government did around the certified IAM working groups, they were trying to certify a set of published standards around how do you have a trust authority, who do you create trust with, who should you as consumers of those services use to trust? Is it VeriSign? Is it Intrust? Is it these credit bureaus? They had all these published lists of, by the way, people who weren't identity vendors, but people who had captured millions and millions and millions of identities and verified them, right? Why not start, think about the problem differently. The problem is they did all this great work in the working group, published some great standards, but the operational component is light years away, right?
And so I'd be interested to know where login.gov, right, fits into that conversation that you were just talking about, because I can't remember the gentleman's name. It was at a conference a couple of years ago, but he was speaking, talking about login.gov, what they were doing and how they were trying to go about it, and the struggles they had at getting it together, and then trying to get the rest of the organizations to take it on. So they tried to centralize this service and then go to the DMV and say, okay, DMV, please use login.gov, right? So that way customers don't have to, have all these different things. You have one central place to go and authenticate. I was like, look, that's a great. When he first started talking and the vision they had, I laughed so hard in the back, right? Because I was like, I've been in the government. I was like, good fucking luck, right? You just, I already, before he even started speaking, I already knew all the things that he hit about building it and then finding the right talent and then trying to get people to take it on. And then they were like, well, part of what they added to their program, and I saw his point, but I didn't necessarily agree with it, was to make sure that typical government projects don't get stale, right? Because it's the same person that just sits there, they feel like they're comfortable, I don't have to do anything else. So what they instituted in an ability to keep things fresh was that as a government personnel, you could only work on that project, I think it was like 2 years or maybe 4 years. They did it like everything else, right? You had to rotate through. And in any other standard, I was like, that's probably a good move. I was like, but in the government where things take so long to push, like you do need some kind of stability. So all you're doing is every 2 years, you're starting over again.
Creating a learning curve, yeah.
Because that person's out. Now a new person's in who's running the project. Now everything else remains like what they did, but that person's got to get up to speed and do all these things, and they've got new ideas, and they waste a year trying to do that. Then they get another year of actual productivity, and then they're gone, right? And that's part of the reason why login.gov just hasn't
I
gone
think,
as far as they wanted it to.
I think as the space continues to mold into this public-private working relationship, so not just the government in general, but the client-side companies engaging with solution providers, the more those partnerships take place. Today, we sell them software, they buy it, consume it, deploy it, and use it. And then we, as the solution providers, don't necessarily carry any burden of the operational success, right? Long-term. They pay their renewals, they pay their subscription, whatever they pay. So there's no real partnership. I think that we'll get to a point at some point, and don't let me put a year to it, where we'll own some of that burden with them, and then that will make the reason we partner to do business together more successful.
Right. I think we talked about a little about this in Denver. I think that at some point to really solve this, right? It's not going to be one entity that goes off and does it, right? Because we're never going to trust the government to do it. Right? Because that starts the whole national ID issue, and people are going to rail against that.
I don't know. Like, listen, if you want a fascinating case study, go look at the country of Estonia. Like 4 years ago, they completely moved to a digital identity ecosystem. Now, again, I know scale and size is way different in the United States from America.
Right.
Having said that, the government plays a very clear role in what they steward for you as a digital identity. They have mission statements like you will input your data once for the rest of your life and only once. And then they have a very mature opt-in, opt-out strategy for who you share data with and how you share. And all the private sector, healthcare, pay, everything else that wants to provide a consumable service in the country of Estonia opts into that digital ecosystem. It's not called government-controlled identity. It's not called the national identity standard. But the government plays a massive role in ensuring that everyone conforms to doing business with that same element of operation.
So the engineer in me looks at that and goes, that's logical, and it should happen. The human being in me looks at that and goes, you really think we're going to trust our government with that?
Oh, yeah, partisanship won't ever allow it.
You know what I mean? Like there's way too much corruption in the history of our government politics to see that actually go through without some sort of like almost dictatorship style, communist style move that says, look, we're just going to do it.
But I think that's emblematic of exactly why login.gov has, I'm not going to say failed. It just hasn't.
It's not matured enough.
It's not matured enough.
Yeah.
And it's not the only example. So in the Estonian example is interesting because there's two threads here to pull. The first is why do those efforts? It's not the only one. MyGovID down in Australia is another example, right? Where there was an opt-in and you could onboard and sign in as a citizen, and citizens were like, nope, not interested, right? Because those constructs were built based upon that old 7-layer cake, right? It was an aggregation of all of this persistent, personal, identifiable information that you needed to either agree to allow the government to hold and manage for you, or agreed to give to the government, freely, so that they could hold on to it for you. That model is bust, right? But when you look at the things that are being successful, they're coming at the problem from, and I'm going to be frank, from the correct angle. It all comes back to that most important question of, are you who you say you are?
Right.
So in effect, we talk about, we don't want to say national ID, but in effect we're already there, but not a national identity, a national authenticator. The rollout of the Real ID standard has been really interesting. So the U.S. government didn't say that all 50 states and territories must have an official federal driver's license and identity card. What they did was they said, you must have a driver's license or identity card that meets these minimum criteria right? And that criteria includes, and I typically pull out my driver's license because I've got a Colorado one with the real ID stamp. It includes on the card anywhere, and I've put this in front of crypto people, it includes 8 to 13 discrete encryption capabilities on the card. And then when you look at what that does, right, and it's the same in New South Wales as it is in Colorado, because you now have a trusted credential for authentication in that form, now I can do cool stuff with it. So we were part of the consortium of partners, Colorado State Government and us, to build the first production digital driver's license in the United States. We would not have been able to do that without the introduction of the Real ID standard, because we knew the minimum authentication criteria that was responsible to make that card functional in the digital realm. They did the same thing down in New South Wales. They've had over, I believe it's over 1.5 million citizens who have freely jumped on board and downloaded and gotten their digital driver's license, right? Mm-hmm. They're still not using it, still not a trusted credential relative to the transaction and flow of life. But we're answering the question in the right way, as opposed to being confused by the history, right? We're saying, what's important is not does everyone have tons and tons of your information about you and holding on to it forever, is in the moment of a digital transaction, when I cross the veil between where I'm sitting and what I'm doing in the digital world, can I prove that I am who I say I am? That approach is going to be the thing that causes this rocket ride that's coming over the next couple of years.
But here's where I think systemically what's always been the problem. We've always used something that was built for an intended purpose and misused it for a different purpose.
Agreed.
So I'll go back to Active Directory. I'm sorry, Microsoft. Active Directory was a file and print server.
Yeah.
And then we started to use it for a directory. Now they have fixed it, right? It no longer carries all the infrastructure burden, and it is a true directory. But let's say it took them a decade or two to really make it what it was being used for today. Your Social Security number was not ever intended to be a national identifier, right? It was intended to help you have money taken from you and given back to you when it's time to draw upon Social Security. Yet we use that 9-digit identifier for everything in life: credit, verification. Your driver's license was meant for what it's called, right? It was meant to show that you have a permit in that state to drive. Yet here we are using it for. So the idea that we're moving to a federally compliant identification system is the right step forward, because we keep misusing all the things that we take from ourselves today and try to use it for a different purpose.
When we look at the capabilities, when we look at it, it's already technically possible. We have all the capabilities today to create a world where I can authenticate not just with a national authenticator. I can authenticate with a national authenticator with dynamic encryption. It can change every single time that I present it, right? That is really incredible, right? Because we make it really hard for somebody to spoof a human being, a living human being, in the digital world. Because now we create a method for somebody not only to show that I am who I say I am, but there are unique characteristics relative to this encryption, that's associated with me that you can't duplicate, right? And it's, I get really, really enthusiastic about what the potential opportunities are, because this also could be the thing that short circuits. The point that you made about Social Security numbers is so good, right? A lot of people.
Richard Bird said my point was so good. I need that on the record.
I mean, it's on video, so we got it.
Please continue.
Yeah, but there's a lot of conversations going on in Washington about who was it that monetized Social Security numbers. It wasn't the federal government. It was commercial interests, right? Commercial interests, credit bureaus, and everybody else got in the game, right? Banks began to use them. Look, I can pull out of my little, keepsakes basket at home. I can pull two things out. I can pull out my the Ohio State University ID, and I can pull out my United States military ID, and both of them had as my identification number my Social Security number printed right on the card, right? And so there's this discussion about if commercial interests took and turned the Social Security number into a risky asset, right? Why don't we just publish them, right? Demonetize their value. Treat them for what they've always been meant to be treated as, which is a piece of your identity defining information.
Not the verifier,
Right.
but a
Right.
component of
Yeah.
numerous components of verification.
Yeah, and to be honest, those conversations can't be held if you're still thinking about the old world of protecting the asset. And I want to come back to that because this is the piece that was really eye-opening for me. And I always like to be really, really upfront and just honest about my own, transition, right? When I worked in the corporate world, and frankly, when I consulted, I didn't care about citizen identities. I didn't care about authentication relative to human beings, whether it be for immigration or for driving or for, elections. Didn't care, right? As I've been in a space where everything that I do is about identity, now I really care. I was just wrong, right? Because my interests were that commercialization aspect. And as I started really digging in and studying, one of the things that's really fascinating, you can come through history and see society and culture and civilization after civilization that had critical components of those empires and those nation states and those governments that were stolen, right? We look at, looted art by the Nazis. We look at, the damages done in London by the Blitzkrieg. We can look at all of these points in history, and the notion of protecting stuff, right, survives even after the stuff is stolen. This is why we see companies that just misfire on their security obligations, get crushed, get fined to death, and they're still in business.
Right.
Because you can survive the asset. There is no civilization in history that ever survived not protecting their people, right? And this is the big change. Like, if you don't protect your people, what happens to you is the end, right? If you do not put the focus on the human element, right? And all the stuff that's attached to that human element, because people now, especially old colleagues, are like, well, what about non-human identities? What about IoT? What about, and I'm like, they're all digital interfaces for a human being. They might be programmed to run by themselves and you never have to, pay attention to them, but they're all programmed as a part of the productivity cycle of human beings.
Right.
Right? Focus on the human.
So I do want to make, one comment. You said that, we should, if we're going to use the social security numbers, we should just make them public. Like we did that. OPM and Equifax did that for us. So that's
we got help.
Thanks, because that's at this point,
but
like
they're still monetized. I really think his bigger point was why even have a national identifier? Why have listen? The mistake I think we should all own up to at some point in our industry is we used to tell companies, hey, as part of this identity program, you must create a global unique identifier for every user object or user ID that you have in your directory. No, you could now. I completely understand. Hey, we could use 11 attributes about a person to determine that person. Doesn't have to be one attribute, right? In fact, using multiple attributes about that person minimizes the risk to all those attributes being exposed because you need the collection of them to say it's Robert Block, not just Robert's social or just Robert's address. Or so I do wholeheartedly agree that we could lessen the burden on PII if we made sure that we could find a way to minimize the impacts of people owning it.
Well, and you mentioned address, and I always like to bring that up as an example. We all know our experiences with physical addresses, and we all know how both persistent an address is throughout our life, as well as how accurate it is within at least some amount of time. What's really freaky is that's an unprotected, publicly knowable piece of information, and it is more accurate than my social security number in identifying me, right? This piece of information is a more accurate, it has a substantial error rate in it, right? But my social security number has an even bigger error rate in it based upon crimes and breaches and all that stuff. And we look at one and say, well, that's not important.
Right.
And we look at the other and say, you need to keep it secret and protect it. Just such so many proof points about how the overall equation has been looked at wrong. And I always try and be cautious here. We always just have to remember that technology was born in the air gap, right? It was born in a space where, security wasn't the issue. We've all worked in this industry for a long time. We know that security has been a secondary topic, tertiary topic, for years, right? I need business functionality. I want a rewards program for my customers, kick the dev cycles out, worry about the application scans later, let me get to production. This has been the life that all of us has lived, right? And only recently have we started to see the economic consequences mounting to a point where it's getting people's attention? I'm of the mind it's not changing things, but it's getting people's attention. And the reason I say I'm of the mind it's not changing anything, if you believe that published Hirschquebec number for 2021, which is $6 trillion in cybercrime losses, I've had people that have walked up to me and said, well, geez, Richard, no wonder, identity's booming. Like $6 trillion is a lot of money. And I'm like, no.
Right.
No, $6 trillion, if you've worked in banking, like I have, $6 trillion is basically 1.25 days worth of global clearing of the entire world economy. That's it.
Right.
That's how much money moves from one account to another in the world in a day. And that number is not compelling enough for businesses to get their act together. And what is that number? That number could be terrifying, right? That number could be something in the 30, 40, $50 trillion mark.
You said it.
So I'm gonna have to hold on one second because we do have to wrap up. We're getting the sign that we have to wrap
The
up.
hour's up. Wow.
I'm telling you, you know how it happens when we get together. So so obviously there's gonna have to be a part 2. I see that now. We'll make that happen.
Or a part
But-
After you get your made up title.
After I get my made up title, there'll be a part 2 to this discussion. So. But as we get ready to wrap up, want to go around, give you guys, parting shots. Like one big thing that you want to see going forward in the state of identity. Let's start with you, Rob.
I'm going to steal from Richard because that was the point I was going to make a second ago, and I'll just wrap on that point. We won't see change until tragedy happens. You said it, I think, on a LinkedIn or a Facebook post a few months ago. All this financial impact to these breaches, the companies are still in business the day after. All these regulatory fines being levied against companies, they're still in business the day after. When we experience death from an identity breach or a real tragedy from an identity breach, we'll have change in legislation started immediately and immensely, right? I hope we don't get to that point, but I really think you made a really great point when you said that tragedy is what moves things in America, unfortunately, and that's what we're still waiting for that shoe to drop.
Yeah, I really do appreciate the note on that, because the frustrating point is that I do think that people don't recognize that there are bad people that are actively trying to find ways to cross that threshold in the digital to create human physical harm, right?
Power plants, things, right?
Yeah,
correct.
and even down to like the example I gave with the National Health Services, surgeries that have to be moved because the
Ransomware on the
WannaCry virus,
systems,
crushes
yep.
everything, right? So it's going to happen, and that mortality component will definitely be a game changer. But I do think if there was one thing that I want to see, I do want to see the move of identity into a place where we can do what is really the most important thing in securing the world, securing everything, right? Which is give people power,
Right.
Empower people to be a part of their identity. I mean, I'm not suggesting things like SSI or that.
No, but
What
let
I'm
me
sa-
be my
yeah.
own identity service provider,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, let me have my authenticator. Let me be able to prove that I am who I say I am, and that will cause this cloud of hopelessness and defeatism that we all have. I mean, you've heard me say it. Like, the worst thing a CISO ever has said in front of me is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Like in what other human endeavor do we ever walk around going, I know I'm going to lose. I know I'm going to lose. And that's the way that we've built the entire cybersecurity framework.
Yeah.
We know we're going to get beat, right? We can change that script if we give power. And if we give power to an individual, to my mom and dad, so they can authenticate, like we can give empowerment to CEOs to feel that they can better protect the assets as well as the human beings, right? That's what I really want to see, is just give people the power to have a say in their security in the digital world.
I think we need to end on that note. Seriously. That kind of trumps anything I was going to say anyway.
Oh.
Gentlemen, as always, it's always good seeing you. It's always good hanging out with you guys and talking. Let's make a part 2 happen.
Absolutely.
Maybe we'll do
I'm
a
in.
remote destination.
Nah, we'll get together again.
I'm thinking like Hawaii.
Aruba.
no doubt.
Yeah, man.
Aruba would be
In
good.
February.
We should get some mics. I'll hit up the guys here at Permanent Record. Like, hey, we're just all just going to go out on the beach for a while. You guys just bring the equipment and we'll just talk.
Maybe we should just go back to that chop house in Kansas City.
All right. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. Till the next cocktail, to the next conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.